sound bad. Taylor?
We are talking Studio 666. This one is directed by BJ McDonnell, who primarily has worked as a kind of behind the scenes guy, camera operator, kind of on the technical side of film production. Has a lot of kind of credits, but mainly in that kind of category. And this, of course, is the Foo Fighters horror comedy movie. Yes, Dave Grohl and the rest of the band have made a movie that was filmed during the pandemic. Now, this is a horror comedy, and your enjoyment of this movie, I suppose in some ways it's going to depend on how much you like the Foo Fighters. Now, just so we're kind of clear and up front, I'm aware of the Foo Fighters, I've heard a few songs, but I'm not especially a fan of them. I'm not all that familiar. I'm more familiar with Dave Grohl from his days in Nirvana. And I think how much you like the Foo Fighters is going to obviously affect your enjoyment of this movie. So just so we're clear, I'm going to be coming at this really just from a film perspective. How good is it as a movie? How good is it for more of a casual kind of fan, or maybe someone who is unfamiliar with the Foo Fighters, you know, completely, rather than someone who's a huge Foo Fighters fan, although we will kind of comment on that. The basic story is this: the Foo Fighters are wanting to record their 10th album. Because it's such an important number, they want to do something special. So they are suggested that they record this 10th album in this particular house. Now, unbeknownst to them, this house has a dark history involving some type of demonic kind of worship, and it's fair amount of death. Now, when we're there, the band seem to love it, and they seem to, are inspired by the surroundings, and they have to record this particular kind of like song to finish the album. But of course, if they do that, they may well lose their souls along with their lives. What will happen? You have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works in this movie. And again, I'm going to be coming at this more from an objective point of view rather than a kind of a fan of the Foo Fighters, but we'll kind of touch on that again. So let's just talk about what it's like as a horror comedy. What I think works. I think one of the major things here, outside of obviously the novelty of having the Foo Fighters in a movie, is the high amount of gore here. It's actually a quite gory film, more so than a lot of kind of like horror movies that we've actually seen in kind of recent years. I mean, it's not every 5 minutes, but when we do see kind of kills, they make the most of the kind of the gore shots. So this is definitely for a rock / heavy metal kind of horror movie gore fan audience, because there are some gruesome deaths. It's done in a kind of somewhat comedic fashion, so think along the lines of Peter Jackson and kind of Sam Raimi, rather than kind of things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Hostel and things like that. But yeah, nonetheless, there's a hell of a lot of painful looking deaths, including someone kind of getting chainsawed down the middle, various kind of like people getting barbecued, things like this. A lot of gruesome and very well done practical effects. Now, the film obviously, its director primarily comes from a technical background, so even though this movie is probably relatively kind of low budget, it's technically a pretty soundly made movie in regards to obviously camera placement, its technical side of stuff, sound design and things like this, all to a good standard. There's lots of kind of fun cameos here. I don't want to give any too many away for you, but there are some cameos both from the horror community and the kind of musical community, as well as a couple of small performances by the likes of Will Forte and a couple of other kind of like recognisable kind of character actors and things like that. I actually think Dave Grohl does quite a good job of pretty much leading the film. Out of all the kind of the band here, he clearly has kind of the most confidence on camera, I would say, and it kind of shows. And his kind of performance is kind of the most fun. is actually kind of funny at times. I do think this movie it's not like a laugh out loud minute. I think the humour is sprinkled in there, but when we do have a few gags, I think there are some kind of funny gags here and kind of amusing kind of set pieces. And there's also a few kind of winks and nods to horror movies and kind of stuff like that. In particular, like some kind of the Evil Dead, The Burning, things like this. If you're a horror movie fan, you would kind of enjoy kind of spotting the kind of the references. And I have to say, I think the kind of the special effects on the kind of the demonic kind of creatures and looks pretty effective. I have to say, these kind of like shadow people with like glowing eyes and mouths and stuff. I have to say. Looks kind of pretty good. Okay, so what doesn't work? So the biggest problem for me with this movie, it's kind of too long. I mean, it's not a huge length movie really, but it's around an hour and 40 minutes, and this I think could have been a nice punchy 80 minutes, and I think the movie would have benefited so much from that. I suspect, and this is my speculation, they filmed footage, and because this was kind of, I think, driven by Dave Grohl, who primarily doesn't work in film, obviously, I think maybe he was reluctant to kind of, edit it maybe as much as it could have been. But as it stands, the movie feels like it kind of drags at times. Now, again, when I'm talking about the criticisms, I'm coming at this from trying to be critical in regards to objectiveness here. And if you're a Foo Fighter fan, you're going to enjoy seeing the shenanigans here, maybe a little bit more than someone who is less familiar or completely unfamiliar. So again, I'm trying to kind of look at this from an objective point of view. But as the story flow goes, it kind of drags its heels a few times. It's overlong. We get kind of sequences sort of where the band is kind of writing this and performing this kind of this song, which will kind of unleash hell and everything, and they're unnecessarily long sequences, and those kind of sequences could have been trimmed down quite a bit. And I feel it kind of ends when we have this kind of finale, and then we have it's like Return of the King in regards to having these kind of endings and things. It could have been cut down, I think, and be a lot more punchy film, because it does wear out its welcome, I have to say. Now, the movie assumes you are a fan of the Foo Fighters, because it really doesn't give you much in the way of characters without, other than that. As I say, I have a passing familiarity with the Foo Fighters. I know Dave Grohl, but I really don't know the rest of the band. I've never bought a Foo Fighters album or a song, so they're just the rest of the band, So to me, as a character, I felt like we could have got to know these guys a little better. And again, this movie is positioning itself for fans of the Foo Fighters rather than, I think, audiences as a whole, because I didn't really feel there was much in the way of getting to know the band, because it assumes you do, and that's probably down to the writers is assuming that you're watching this for a Foo Fighters, if you're a Foo Fighters fan, and in which case, absolutely you'll be familiar. But those of you who aren't, I think maybe a little bit kind of like, well, you kind of maybe recognise Dave Grohl, but maybe the rest of the guys you're unfamiliar with, kind of like me. It doesn't do a lot of kind of character work to kind of build these guys up once they're in the movie. And they all kind of seem to have, with the exception of maybe one who's kind of maybe portrayed as a little bit more stupid than the others, but they all seem to have very kind of similar personality, really, and kind of all really have the same point of view whilst the kind of the shenanigans are kind of going on, and therefore they kind of seem quite bland in kind of personality. Also, these guys obviously aren't professional actors, and it does show. As I've mentioned, I think Dave Grohl actually has a reasonable kind of presence on screen, and I have seen some critiques of the acting from the band. I actually think Dave Grohl did a decent enough job here, but the rest of the band clearly have don't have the confidence to carry themselves in a way, and the acting isn't the best from them, unfortunately. And we spend a lot of time when they are the main characters. I mean, as much as you have the likes of kind of, Will Forte and such in the movie, they actually have kind of quite minor roles, and the acting is really carried by the actual actors themselves, or so the actors, meaning the band. So, you know, there kind of is that. So, should you watch this movie? I think if you're a Foo Fighters fan, you'll get a lot more out of this than if you are not. So, unusually for me, I'm going to kind of look at this on two ways. I mean, there's been plenty of horror movies that have featured band members. Gene Simmons has been in a bunch of films, and we've had horror movies about heavy metal, because they have this kind of somewhat kind of crossover appeal, I find. But to me, this is certainly one of the most upfront movies about, you know, and starring the kind of the members of the band. So much, you know, maybe the kind of the Beatles' Yellow Submarine had about, you know, it's about that level. So I think how much you like this movie will depend on, you know, if you're a fan of the Foo Fighters or maybe just this kind of rock music. But if you're just watching as a horror fan, I don't think it's particularly kind of anything special, to be honest with you. If you take kind of the fact that you're watching these guys and you're just looking at it as a purely a horror film, it's not bad, but I don't think it's anything special. I would say it's probably about average, to be honest with you. So I would say if you're not massively familiar with the Foo Fighters, it's probably a 5 out of 10, which would be my actual rating. But if you are a fan of the Foo Fighters, these guys are, you know, front and present in the whole movie, and I think you'll get a lot more out of it. And I think you'll enjoy the longer sequences of them kind of talking about music and kind of jamming and stuff. Whilst if you're not as familiar, those scenes I think will certainly drag more. So if you're a fan of the kind of the Foo Fighters, I would say maybe you're looking either 7, possibly in either an 8. But as I say, looking at this objectively, I think realistically for me it's about a 5, but with that kind of little asterisk on there. Have you seen it? What do you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.